So, good morning. Thank you for attending this webinar on guidance for DSA and WDS reviewers. I wanted to give you some background first, then go to some housekeeping announcements, and then the presentation will start. So this is the agenda. Next slide, please, Heiko. As a background, I just wanted to give you some information. The DSA and WDS have started off as separate entities for certification of data repositories, but about 2 years ago, an RDA group was set up to explore if integration of these two entities was possible. Fortunately, it was, and that resulted in new core trustworthy data repository requirements and also a common board consisting of DSA and WDS members. Both entities have quite a history of reviewing assessments, but within this period that they've been doing this, the need for more guidance was felt to promote more consistency. So several workshops and conferences were set up to gather input on this. For instance, within CESDA, which is discipline related regarding the social sciences, but also for a broader public, for instance, in the RDA environment, and of course, everything in between. This gathered information was condensed into the first draft of the extended guidance document, which will be discussed today. And it was also discussed in 2 previous webinars held in June. All the input from those webinars and also from the Core Trust Seal Board have been implemented into the document that has been sent to you for preparation for this webinar. Please note that this document, this extended guidance document, will be updated periodically when necessary because we really want it to be helpful for the reviewers, but also the applicants that are going for certification. This webinar, as I said, will focus on the extended guidance and how it should be used by the reviewer, but at the same time, this gives the applicants of the seal an idea on how to focus their self-assessment. Next slide, please. Then as a sneak preview, I wanted to share that, of course, we have a common board now, but this common board has taken the next step and will be launching a new certification organization, the Core Trust Seal, with the logo as you see now. At the moment, we are working very hard on new statutes and a business model. They're being refined as we speak. And to sustain this new body, we will be asking for a small administration fee that will be charged when the applicant submits their self-assessment for review. The official launch of the CTS, including a new website, will be announced later this week, so keep your eyes out for that. And I have some new housekeeping announcements then now. So participants are muted due to the large number of attendants, but you can unmute for questions or comments. If you do have questions or comments and you don't want to unmute your microphone, of course, you can always use the chat box, but please start your remark with question then. The extended guidance will be discussed in parts and questions will be taken right after each section. So please feel free to comment or ask questions when needed. It would be helpful if you keep the extended guidance document at hand during the presentation, just so as a background information. And like I said, this webinar will be recorded for publication and will probably be publicized on the websites as well, because we think it's a core piece of helpfulness for reviewers and applicants when they're going for certification of their data repository. So now I would like to introduce Heiko Chausma. He will actually be the presenter for this webinar. Heiko is a very esteemed colleague here at DONS, and he has a long-standing experience in reviewing DSA applications. And he's been instrumental in shaping this extended guidance. So over to you, Heiko.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. Good morning or afternoon, wherever you are. I will go through the newly designed extended guidance. This should be distinguished from the general guidance or the standard guidance, which is already included in the requirements document. The idea is to add to this the so-called extended guidance, which is specifically for the reviewers. It was felt as an omission that these didn't exist in the previous certification seals, and we have tried to give the reviewers some guidance here, and I will go through them now. This guidance is divided in two big sections, so to say. There is a general guidance, which I will go through first, and there is then specific guidance for each requirement. The general guidance, you see the elements of that here. I will go through that now. The first is the general points. There are a few general points to keep in mind when reviewing self-assessments. Information may undergo maintenance. That's always possible during the run of the self-assessment. These self-assessments may take sometimes some time, as sometimes at the first round not all the self-assessment requirements items are according to the view of the reviewer sufficiently answered, and then they are resent to the repository, and answer is coming. During that time, things might change, but we really should try to have the assessment at one fixed point in time for the repository, so that we don't have to take into account continuously all the changes which might occur in the repository. Anyway, I think it's a principle that things can change, that many or maybe all repositories still have work in progress, but still we should try to have a fixed point, a stable moment, so to say. About the compliance level, this is in the very beginning. At the first page you see the compliance levels. There are 5 compliance levels from 0 to 4. And the important thing is that the repository may provide a compliance level according to their own opinion, but that the reviewer does not necessarily agree with that. That's in fact the whole point of reviewing or evaluating what's coming to the reviewer. Does he or she agree with it or not? And if he or she doesn't agree with it and gives higher marks, higher level, for example, a 4 instead of a 3, which was proposed, then there is of course no problem. This sometimes happens, but the other way, of course, happens as well. That according to the reviewer, the assessment, the compliance level is estimated too high, and that he or she wants to lower it. And there we have said, if that is the case, then an additional condition is that at the next time of the certification round, the renewal, there should be a higher level that should be demonstrated. Another very general point is, general issue is that one should very well realize that this whole guidance, this extended guidance, is indicative. It's not possible and shouldn't be tried to give an answer to all possible answers. It's not possible to cover every detail. Context of repositories might be very different, so simply not every scenario will be covered, and this should be taken into account. So it should be looked upon flexible. What we have tried with this extended guidance is to give you a general help in the form of these guidelines, these guidance, but we cannot say from before that everything will be covered. Okay. Another general guidance issue is missing evidence. This occurs very often, very regularly, and then the big question is how to handle this. We have now said as a guideline that if information is missing, and missing in such a degree that it is impossible to judge the self-assessment, to judge the requirement, it should be sent back and asking for more information. And what not should be done is to give it, for example, a lower compliance level. If the information is simply missing, you cannot judge it, and it's not so much the fact that it is insufficient or that it is not satisfying. No, it's simply not there, and it should be there. So you, as a reviewer, should ask, could you give some more information on this point? Another point is here. This is also sometimes the case, as the circle of reviewers is not that big yet, that a reviewer might know the repository already from inside. Of course, it will never be the case that a reviewer will review his or her own repository, but on the other hand, it's quite possible, and it has certainly happened in the past, that the reviewer knows the inside of a repository, and so he may think, oh, this is okay, this self-assessment is okay, while the evidence is still missing there. So the point here, what we would like to stress is here very much, there should be evidence, and the judgments should only take place based on the evidence. And this is now, of course, more relevant, as in the new Core Trust Seal certification, all self-assessments will be judged by 2 reviewers. So this is more important than it was in the previous certifications. Another issue, a general issue, is the understandability of the documents. But I said we shouldn't go into detail. That's also the fact here. It should be avoided that the self-assessment should be very detailed. There should not be very long pieces of the evidence there, but it should be as straightforward and as concise as possible. I should add to this point, what I didn't mention yet, is that the intention is that these guidelines, this extended guidance, will also be publicly available. So it's not a kind of a secret guidelines only available for reviewers, but it will be there when it is finally, when the text is finally there, it will be published, and so it might serve not only as a guideline for the reviewers, but also for those who have to write up the self-assessments. So here is an important point. Don't go into too much detail. Indicate clearly different sections of the self-assessment, and be as consistent as possible, and try to give a description of the repository as a whole. Not this again, not going to too much detail, but try to give a full picture, full and consistent picture of the repository. This should also be a point of judgment. Another point, general point still, is the documentation, the evidence, which I mentioned already several times. Basically, this should be in English. The whole self-assessment should be in English. However, there are many repositories, of course, not based in English-speaking countries, and they might have much of their documentation, or maybe all of their documentation, in other languages. That's always acceptable, but on the condition that there has to be a summary of the evidence in English, which should be sufficient, and also clearly, of course. How much summary that should be is not easy to say. I can give you two examples. If you have a simple list of preferred formats, for example, which is asked in one of the requirements, this doesn't need much translation, or not, maybe not at all, only just an indication that this is the list of preferred formats. If on the other hand, you have a document which is also asked for, like a preservation policy, which could or should consist of several pages at least. Of course, there has to be a summary here if this is in any other language than English. And talking about evidence, another point which in the past always came up and will continue to come up is the confidentiality. It's sometimes said by repositories that some of the evidence is confidential, can, for whatever reason, not be shared with others, cannot be made public in particular. It might be for commercial reasons or for security reasons or whatever. This should really be the case. I mean, it should not be the case, of course, that a repository is hiding the fact here that the document is really not there, or is totally insufficient. These should really be the reasons to keep them confidential. This, however, creates a problem when judging the evidence. So we have said that in that case, the evidence should be submitted to the reviewer, and only to the reviewer, and then should be judged by the reviewer as if it was public documentation, public evidence. This could be done by sending it to the general email address of the core trust seal. And preferably, basically, we would like to demand that that in the next round, in the renewal of the seal, the evidence should be made public. And if that is really not possible, really not allowed, for example, then at least there should be a summary of this in a non-confidential way, of course, of this document, so that it can be judged. Okay, these were the general guidance. This was the general guidance. Are there any questions until this point? Was this clear what I said? No questions? Okay, then I go along all the specific requirements, and I starting with requirement 0, the context. There are 16 requirements, or in fact 17, because you also have this 0 point. This looks rather innocent, but it is in fact a quite important requirement, as it should sketch the whole context of the repository. What kind of repository are we talking about? So that should be become clear from the answers given here. It's clear from the repository type. Here it should be indicated what kind of repository we're talking about in broad lines. It's not always difficult. It's not always that easy to define that. Sometimes the repositories have multiple functions. They can both be a library, digital library, and a research data repository, but that should be indicated. And it should also be clearly indicated what is the designated community of the repository. Designated community is a term which comes originally from the OAIS reference model, and trying to indicate what the designated community of a repository is important for a number of requirements to follow. But it should be defined here. And an important point then is how narrow is this designated community, or how broad is it? Does it entail, for example, all social sciences, or is this just one specific field within social sciences, like psychology, for example? This should be indicated. Or is it really even broader than that? And are you, as a repository, operating for all the public? That should be indicated here. And then maybe a bit difficult one is the level of curation performed. There are more options possible here, as again, a repository might curate the data, archive the data on different levels. This runs from content made accessible just in the same way as it was ingested, as it was submitted to the archive. Nothing done with it, as the lowest possibility into the highest degree, the data level curation, which entails enhancement of documentation, conversion to new formats, additional editing of the deposited data. This is about the degree of work carried out in a repository, and this might vary from repository to repository, and as I said, it might vary in a repository as well. But this should be made clear as much as possible. Another important point, again, these are all important points, these context points, is the outsource partners. It is possible for a repository to outsource activities. That was already possible in the previous section, in previous versions of the DSA, and it's again now possible in the core trust seal, but on conditions. The conditions are that it should be that it should become clear from the evidence what exactly the work is carried out by the outsource partners, and in which way that is contractually fixed. So it should be made clear in what way the outsource partner is responsible for the sustainability of the data, the security of the data. Often outsourcing is about storage of the data in another data provider, and then this responsibility, security should be laid down in written contracts, which should be demonstrated as well. Okay, then I go to the first. If there are no questions on this, by the way, just asking this from time to time. Yes. Please go on.
Okay, this is Frank. I wonder whether the extent of curation can be addressed as a level. I several times found a level a list of levels, where the highest level is that the repository corrects or starts to correct or to change the data it gets to improve them. So for our repository, this is definitely not an option. So all changes in our policy has to be done by the scientist, which actually means that we never get to a level where we change something. So maybe a word like extent of the curation might fit better than level of curation. What do you mean?
I think I think I understand what you mean. There's a point there, and as far as I understood, it's also a bit a point of debate whether you say the optimum situation should be that every repository has level D, has data level curation, or not, because many repositories simply don't do that, as you say. They don't do this data level curation, and not, anyway, not in the way it's described here. There will be somewhere in B and in the middle of B or C, and that. But I think the only point is here that it should be very clear what exactly the level is what you are doing. Yeah, just a very general answer to your question is that the extended guidance which we are discussing today, and what you also see here in these slides, is, as I said, still not fully total. It depends also on remarks you might make. On the other hand, the guidance itself and the descriptions from the requirements cannot be changed in the short run, because they have been defined by the board of the CTS. But it's a point to note. I think it certainly is something that there sometimes is misunderstanding about this.
Just to say what we do in case we find errors, for instance, or necessary changes, and when we are not able to call back to the data producing scientist, in those cases we annotate these observations.
Yes, well,
change the data.
At the Institute where I'm working, DANS, we do the same. If it's something very, very small, we change it. If no question that it's just an error, small error, okay. Nobody will care about that. But if it's anything larger than that, we try to contact the depository, and if that's not possible, we leave it. We're not going to change in the data themselves. Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
We're not going to change without approval by the depository. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, but I don't know, of course, but I guess that that is the policy in most repositories. You're not going to change. You're not going to change in the data unless it's clearly a typo or something. But otherwise, you're not going to change anything. But that's still it's still the case that, of course, these levels might vary. To say it bluntly, some repositories have enough money to do more extended curation, and some don't simply have the funds to do that and just store the data as they get them. That's the reality, I think. Yes, is that an answer to your question?
Yes, I think so. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yes, just wanted to start with requirement 1, which is about the mission, the scope of the repository. And I think this is a rather straightforward requirement. It simply asks to indicate what exactly is the official mission of the repository, and in particular also in what organization the repository is embedded. Almost always repositories are embedded in a larger umbrella organization, or they are possibly sometimes on their own. But anyway, this has to be indicated and has to be sketched how the situation is officially. And that is mostly not that difficult. One point is here that in fact that it speaks for itself. I would say that if we're talking about repositories, so the essential activity here is data management. And if data management is not mentioned at all in this mission statement, then in fact you could say this is a bit strange. Maybe it's still explainable, but data management should be there. What is the repository in a general way doing with data management? But if this would be missing, it cannot get a compliance level of 3 or higher. Please interrupt me with questions if you don't agree or have other questions. The second requirement about the licenses, all the licenses the repository could maintain, and this it's my personal opinion that this is also rather straightforward. When we talk about licenses, we talk about, on the one hand, licenses when depositing data, so agreements between depositors and the repository, and on the other hand, the conditions of use, in fact, the agreements between the repository again and the user, its users. And then these licenses, what I see of this is that they become more and more professional and more legal during the run of time. So that means, and this is necessary, it means that attention should be paid to the liability, the responsibility, who keeps the responsibility for the data, and a very important point, what limitations are there on use? Limitations, for example, because of protection of personal data or protection of commercial data. And then connected with that, who is allowed to, if the data are limited, have limited access, who is allowed to still have access? Mostly that is defined as researchers, but is that all correctly written down in the licenses? An important point is then what will happen if there is non-compliance with the rules, in particular the rules regarding access use of data. What is the repository going to do? Will the user be stricken from the list of users or whatever? Does he get a warning? I mean, these not in that detail maybe, but it should be clear what a repository will do then. So far for the license, I would say. And if there are no other questions, I go to number 3. That's the continuity of access. The repository has a continuity plan to ensure ongoing access to and preservation of the data. The word continuity is key here. It should be clear from the evidence that there is continuity in the repository, that it's not just a project funded for 1 or 2 years, but there should be a funding for at least the medium, what is called here the medium term, that would be 3 to 5 years. That is the absolute minimum to say this is a sustainable repository. It should, even more important, it should be clear, or that should be a piece of evidence whether responsibility will be taken over and by whom in the case of that the funding is stopping, will the umbrella organization take over the responsibility? That should be clear in preferably in something like the statutes of the repository or other agreements with the umbrella organization, for example. Or is there something? Is there an arrangement that, for example, the data will be taken over by the National Archive or another archive in a country when funding stops? That's the effect, the main point here in these requirements. That should be in the and should really be in the evidence. I hope that's clear. Then I go to number 4, the confidentiality ethics. This is a point related, of course, I would say, with licenses, because licenses would be the place where this is documented, where this is made operational, so to say. But the point here is that the repository has to demonstrate that it follows all applicable legal, ethical, and disciplinary rules. It follows legal, so it should follow the laws, but it should also follow the so-called soft laws, the codes as the codes of conduct are often described. In many countries, there are codes of conduct for handling, in particular, handling personal data and or for research. And these should be followed by the repository. There should be an awareness at least, but it should be clear from the licenses that these all these different obligations and rules are followed. And this, of course, is in particular the case with the sensitive area of personal data, in particular the sensitive personal data. There are very strict rules, and there are European laws even more strict to come on this. So this is not only a question of that it should be in the licenses, but also that it should be in the organization of the repository should be made clear that these are sensitive data which should be taken care for. Staff has to be aware of this, and there should be it should also in a technical way be safe to have these data. Not only personal data, it can also in many disciplines there can be sensitive data which have to be protected, like the protection of the exact place of an archaeological site, which has to be protected to prevent plundering of these sites. I don't think this is a very again a very difficult point. And then the organizational infrastructure. The organizational infrastructure concentrates on adequate funding, enabling it, amongst other things, that there will be a qualified staff to run the repository in a responsible way, and that this funding, as already described earlier in the second requirement, that this funding should be sufficient. This is a bit more in detail, you could say. It's important to know for the reviewer how structural or project-based funding is for sections of the data personnel. There are, of course, some key functions in a repository, but not only the key functions. For many functions, it's important to know how permanent the funding will be, or are we talking about a repository where almost all functions are paid by temporary projects? That makes it a difference for the sustainability. And then we should know again, how long this funding period, the safe funding period will be. Often with umbrella organizations, like in my own organization, there are periodic renewals of the contract for a repository, and this is also important for the reviewer to know. But this also this point also entails some knowledge about training facilities for the staff. In a general way, it has to be made clear that staff is professional and will be there for a number of years. Okay, then I go to number 6, the expert guidance. This is the last one, by the way, of the requirements on organizational infrastructure. The first 6 requirements, 1 to 6, are as you have noticed on the organizational infrastructure. This one is about the relation with, in fact, the relation with the designated community. As it says, the expert guidance, but it's wider than only the designated community. It could refer to the description of the designated community in the 0 requirements, but here it has to be made clear in what way this designated community comes in, to say it in that way, in the repository. Are they listened to, the members of the designated community? Is the repository built upon the standards and guidelines of the specific designated community? And in what way is there, for example, an advisory committee taking care of this, of that given discipline? But you need expertise in a very wide field, as I said, not only in the field of the specific discipline, but also in the general field of information technology, which is a fast-changing area. You need advice and guidance. You possibly need advice and guidance on legal matters, organizational matters, financial matters. That has to be made clear in this requirement. Any questions until so far? If not, I go to the next block, to the next section, which are 7 requirements on digital object management. Yes?
Somebody has a reaction in the chat, please.
Is it in the chat? Have a look. Sorry. Sorry, my chat box was not not open yet. I'm sorry. I'm now reading it. It says, in some cases, the formal commitment for continuity and infrastructure support should be given by an overarching organization rather than by the data center. Is that considered as proper evidence when the data center is fully dependent from the external context? Yes, well, the first part of your question, yes, I think a formal commitment by an overarching organization is okay. I think is good, could be approved. This is, I think, in practice, this is often the case. What you mean by dependent from the external context? That's another context. Then I think the overarching organization then has the responsibility, in fact, for the repository. And that should be sufficient. If there's other output from the other influences by the external, by other external parties, that is not important in a way, I think, because it's important that the overarching organization, which is probably also funding you, is there. If that not, it could be the case that you are part of an umbrella organization, so formally that's okay, but still that you are, and that's maybe what you're referring to, you're part of in a very large degree dependent on external funding or external projects. And this is a bit tricky then, of course. Yeah. No, that's indeed what you say. You're completely dependent on government.
Can you hear me?
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, very well.
I'm Frederic Klet. I send the comment, and my question is also specifically when you the center essentially depends on the hosting institute, so it's not only financial dependency, but also material dependencies on the local resources, and so that in terms of commitment for the continuity of the data center, essentially, as director of the data center, I cannot commit myself. It's essentially dependent on the direction of the hosting institute.
Yes. Yes, I see your point, but this, I mean, I think it remains the fact that there is a formal commitment then by your government departments to sustain you, I guess. And maybe what you say, you're not very independent yourself, but there is a formal commitment that and there is an annual budget. So I think from a point of view of the requirements, that would be sufficient as long as you have this formal commitment and as long as you get this annual budget. Preferably, of course, a budget for a cycle of 5 years or so. That would be preferably, as it says in the requirements. But again, this formal commitment is in my eyes, it would be the key point here. If you understand what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Do you agree with that? Yeah. I think that's the point here. And the way I think if you have an umbrella organization, it's from my limited experience is that how autonomous you are as an organization can be very different. Sometimes you're very autonomous, and sometimes you are not at all. That you might have very different situations there.
We have an umbrella organization in our case, the International Astronomical Union, but this organization doesn't provide any support, any financial support. So it's only scientific supervision for data quality and so on, but for the actual operations, they cannot help.
No, I see, but that's for me. I think that's a clear point. These are there's a distinction here. Your designated community, it's very clearly this international organization, but this is not your funding partner or your funding organization. That's the government department. So you're still dependent on your government department for your existence. And there again, this formal commitment is a key point. And scientific, you might say that scientifically speaking, the international organization might maybe have some responsibility or anyway is guiding for you, but not in a financial way or organizational way. But I think these are different things.
That's one of the difficulties when you have this sharp separation between, I would say, the scientific supervision for data quality and so on, and the material part. The funding organization is also the supervising organization. Then, of course, commitments are easier. But if you have two fully separate entities, then in terms of various commitments for the data center, it makes things more difficult.
Yes, it's true. And I think both scenarios happen. In our case of our organization, part of the Academy of Arts and Sciences. They are a very general umbrella organization, and we are, for our disciplinary environment, more dependent on international organizations, in our case in the field of social science and humanities. But you also have organizations where this is the same, like in Germany you have the Max Planck Society, for example, a Max Planck organization, which where you would have both. But I mean, this is what I said at the very beginning. The context of repositories might really might be very varying. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Then, if you
may I?
Yes. Yes.
This is Frank. May I stay with this point for a minute? What is continuity in terms of years? Is this a guarantee for 3 or for 5 years? I think you were very right when you referred to the political questions. And let me tell you, in climate science, we had the situation that after another president had been elected, we did not know whether our friends which were financed by DOE, by the ministry, or were financed by NASA, would be able to go on to cooperate with us. So what happened is that we started to stream quickly as much as possible of the data that were hosted by them.
Yes.
So none of us can be sure that after the next elections, continuity still is 100% guaranteed, I think.
Yeah, that's. I think I fundamentally I agree with that. Of course, there's always the risk that for political reasons or whatever reasons, the money there's no money anymore. The money runs dry for your repository. And that's why it's important, as I said in one of these first requirements, that there has to be some arrangements for continuity. That I don't know where to go in this in the climate case you mentioned. I of course heard about that. That you had arranged that before this political switch in the United States. But this would be preferable. I mean, because there's always this risk. There's this that you have, and in one way or another way. And we now get in Europe international data infrastructures, and these might also. It's contemplated. It's not yet arranged there, but it's contemplated that this international organization also might function as a kind of general backup, in case 1 or 2 data repositories fall away. This is especially the case in the Eastern European countries, where you have new repositories coming up, and funding is not sure there at all. And then it would be good for them if it would be able to move that data in case of need to other countries. Mm-hmm. So that's the same point, in fact. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So guarantee we only can for something like 5 years, or in our case maybe 8 years.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's a very important point. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for this for these comments.
You're welcome.
Thanks. It's very very interesting. But now I go on with requirement number 7. This is about data integrity and authenticity. This is a very long one. You can see that already in the description, that it covers a lot of points. And what we say in the guideline is that one should try, also when reviewing it, that to keep it as simply as possible, and in fact to describe every bullet point separately. And not make it too long, but there are, I must admit, this is a rather long one. There are a number of points here. It's all about the integrity and authenticity, which are here defined as integrity is about the changes to the data, the documentation of changes to data and metadata, and the the fact that this all should be traced back. Authenticity is about reliability of the original data. Where do they come from? Is this the original data set coming from that or that research institute or university? And then there is a number of items mentioned here. Are these changes documented? Are they logged, and how? Do you have version control strategy? Do you have a strategy for data changes? Repositories often have, but it's also often implicit. So this should be, if it's implicit, it should be made explicit. How is provenance looked into? And all these kinds of issues which are important to see whether data are and can remain authentic and keep their integrity. So that's a rather long and complicated point here, but it should be made clear in separate points. Okay, no questions. Then I go to the appraiser. Yes.
Does this point include, for instance, the fact that data are get a long-term identifier like DOIs, for instance? Is it part of this?
Yeah, yes, you're right. But this comes also back in a later requirement. Just a second. This comes back in number 13. But you wouldn't, maybe you wouldn't expect it there, but it's in number 13, which is about data discovery and identification. But I agree with you. It could also be here. Yeah, it's of course a very important point for repository. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Appraisal. Here the designated community comes in again. What is the collection development policy of your the collection policy of the repository? Of course, very much connected with the designated community. Are you collecting the data which are relevant for the designated community? And then this is linked to the question whether they are and remain understandable for its users. So important point here, is there a list of preferred formats? Are there quality control checks in place? And what then are you doing when you get data in non-preferred formats? And this often means that there is not really a guarantee that these data will survive in the next 10, 20 or 30 years. No guarantee for eternity can be given at all, of course, but still everybody in a repository knows that some data formats are much safer from the long-term preservation point of view than others, and this should be made clear here in this requirement. Number 9, the documented storage procedures. This is very much about the storage and the documentation of the storage. And when talking about the documentation, preferably there should be a preservation policy, a document in which there are clear lines how the data are handled, how the data are backupped, are there copies in multiple places, how safe are the data in fact, and how safe are they against the risks they are running. Not so much only the political risks we already discussed, but more like short-term disasters. Thinking about the hurricanes, for example, which come along and might destroy data centers. Are there safety measures in place there is there any risk management in place? And essential, always essential in the whole certification, are all these procedures there? Are they documented? Are they documented in a way that not only one data manager who handles this for years already knows this, but also other data managers might understand them. And number 10 is about the preservation plan, which has to be distinguished from the preservation policy. Preservation plan is more on the long-term preservation of the data. The repository assumes the responsibility, but that means that it has to be able to give continued access, and that there should be sufficient documentation to support that continued access. And what, again, preferably you would like to have here is a preservation plan which gives answers to these questions, and in particular give answers to possible changes in technology, possible changes in the requirements of the users. And another point is when talking about responsibility, this is also mentioned in the guidance, that also in a legal way, it should be clear in what way, if and in what way the repository takes over responsibility. Has the responsibility the right to copy and in particular transform and change and store the items, the data items being submitted to the repository? And is that should be in the licenses. So here's a link with the requirement number 2 to the licenses. Okay. Number 9, the data quality. Again, important point here is the designated community. It says also in one of the points of the guidance there should be a description of the ability of the designated community to comment on and or rate the data metadata. Rating the data, this is something like effect like you have with Amazon.com, of course. This is, as far as I know, still very much beginning, but some repositories do this, and anyway give that designated communities the possibility to comment and to rate the data. This, of course, in a general way points to the fact that the repository is there for the designated community in the first place, and this should be demonstrated in the evidence. It should be demonstrated how the repository handles the data and metadata quality of the data. So again, documentation here. Oh, sorry, I'm going. Yeah. Then, yeah, this was about the data quality. Then I go to the workflows. This is here again. Sorry, it's a bit tedious, but again, the word documentation comes in, which is really vital here. Every repository has, of course, in reality, in real life, workflows. The point is often that these workflows are not documented that well. And sometimes in the worst scenario, worst case, there are only in the head of 1 or 2 data managers or IT support managers or whatever. And this is not a good situation. So here, documentation of workflows is key. There should be a clear document or more documents on these workflows. And these are sometimes internal documents. This is what I mentioned in the very beginning when going through the general points, that sometimes these are typically documents, if they exist, which are internal, maybe for understandable reasons, but anyway, it should be made clear to the reviewer how these workflow processes are documented. This point also includes the appraisal and selection of data, as this is part of the workflow. Maybe this is not the most logical place, the most logical requirement to have this here, because it's more mostly about the content of the data. It can, however, also be on the documentation and technical state of the data. I mentioned this number 13 earlier already when some of you, or one of you mentioned in requirement number 7 the persistent identifier. It has a place here as part of the general demands for data discovery and identification. This is relatively straightforward. It's on the search and harvesting facilities offered by a repository, and it should contain evidence of that, and also whether it should also contain information whether a repository is included in a registry, but also it could give information on recommended data citations. But one of the most important points here remains the presence of persistent identifiers. Data reuse. This is the last one of the digital object management block. Yes, sorry?
Excuse me.
Yes.
You mentioned permanent identifiers. Of course, that's the direction in which we want to go. But
yes.
Well, there are financial aspects and things like that. Would it be a requirement, or is it are the data centers encouraged to do that, but that it's not mandatory to, for instance, get DOIs for data sets at least in the near future?
Yes, that's a very good question, to be honest, because this is also one of the general points which we try to cover in the beginning. Which of these points are really mandatory? Which is your question? If you look at the guidance of this requirement, you see something like six bullets, and the last one of these bullets is does the repository offer persistent identifiers? Now, what happens when this is not there yet, or simply is not there? I mean, there can be, as you say, financial or other reasons that a repository doesn't have persistent identifiers. How vital is that? And that is, it's a bit difficult to say, to be honest. It doesn't say explicitly persistent identifiers are mandatory as such. But this should be seen in the context of this whole requirement. If a repository has good search facilities, good harvesting facilities, is embedded in several registries and so on, then this requirement could certainly get a compliance level of 3, not 4, of course, because there's something missing then. And this is also maybe a good point to say that it's not necessary to have compliance levels 4 for all the requirements. As I said in the beginning, it's very much acknowledged in the the whole setup of the requirements that there's always work in progress at repositories. So you might say here, I give you 3. The persistent identifiers are missing. Please take care that they are there next round in a few years' time, preferably. So that would be my answer, but it's maybe a bit unsatisfying answer. But yes.
Yes. To side, am I right saying that the for requirement 13, it is okay, for instance, to cite the data by the catalog entry if the catalog has an index, a persistent index. So what I think is that we do not necessarily need formal PIDs like DOI or similar, but of course we need some stable identification for citation.
Yes.
Is that right, or is that how you see things?
Yes, that's my interpretation, of course. But I would say yes. But important is that you explain this, as you just did to me. You explain this in a clear way in your self-assessments.
Mm-hmm.
Then
Okay.
I think all these bullet points should always be placed in what I said in their context. And if you can have a good explanation why you don't use persistent identifiers, but use as you said, an index or so. I think that would be okay. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. Then I started already, or tried to start with data reuse. Here, reuse is the essential word. The data should be reusable. This, you might say, has been mentioned before. Yes, it has been mentioned before in requirement 8 about where these should requirement 8 should contain defined criteria about relevance and understandability. This comes in a way back here, and again aligns with the designated community. The data should be provided in formats which are common for the designated community. The data should be as understandable as possible. And then this is also a point, of course, for licenses. The licenses should enable the deliverance of qualified metadata. So this was the last of the digital objects management block. And now we go to the last 2 ones, which are about technology, the technical infrastructure. These are both rather long requirements. They contain a lot of points. The first one is about the whole technical infrastructure. Here, a key point I would think is that a repository should make clear, should make understandable that it itself has an overview of the whole technological infrastructure, that it understands, so to say, the issues of the whole technical infrastructure. This is important, in particular, because here often activities are outsourced, in particular data storage itself, but also the whole IT part may be outsourced. And then that's all very well, that's acceptable, as I said in the beginning, if there are good contracts or good service level agreements. But still, it doesn't take away that a repository itself has to understand what it is doing, that that's an overview of it, a grip on it. And it should be possible by doing this by using a reference model. In practice, then one thinks, of course, of the OAIS, could also be another reference model. There are often misunderstandings about the OAIS, that it should be completely implemented in a repository. That is certainly not necessary. It's not asked, but it's very advisable to use a reference model like the OAIS as a description way, because it contains all the important activities of a repository. And then here it should be very clear what activities the repository is doing itself and what activities are outsourced, and for what activities it is responsible. This is the technical infrastructure as a whole. The next and last one is about security. This is more specialized, of course. And here again, in particular, here again, the relation with an outsource partner is important. Are there contractual elements in place which cover technical risks, which cover crisis management? Are there disaster plans in place either by the repository itself or in combination or cooperation with the outsource partner? And here, crisis and disasters have been mentioned earlier in the requirements here, but here it's only, of course, in a technical sense, not so much in an organizational way or a legal way, but in the purely technical sense. And essential is, of course, that there are procedures to enable swift recovery of the data and good backups of the data. Again, here the division of tasks between the repository and the outsource partner have to be made visible. I hope that's clear as well. There's only one additional guideline then, which is about the additional information. Here a repository might enter additional information which was not really covered by all the requirements before, but as there are so many points in the requirements, in all these 17 requirements, it's difficult to think of this, but maybe it is the case, and then you can fill that in here. So now we have come at the end of my lecture, so to say, of all these requirements and of the general guidance, which is almost finished by now, and will be published, as Lisa said at the beginning. So here at the end, I only once ask you whether there are still questions or remarks. If not, you can always send this in to me or to the DSA or WDS email, general email addresses, and we will answer them. Then I give back the floor. Yes.
I'd like to ask more about the schedule, because is there a plan when it will be a requirement to have finished the reviews for the new season of the certificate? Because on the side of Clarin, there is not clear picture of this, because they have required DSA as a requirement for certain level centers, and now that the certificate is expiring at the end of this year, there is not certainly enough time for the review process to start, so that the new seal would be usable at the beginning of next year. So,
yeah,
can you enlighten us a bit about this?
Yes, I'm sorry, but I think I give the floor then to Lisa, as she is more she's better in these issues. She knows more about it than I do because she's more in the organization of the DSA. So I give the floor to her.
Thank you, Heiko. Just to make sure that I understand the question correctly, you're asking if you can fill in a self-assessment and it will be reviewed in time for the 1st of January. Is that your question?
That's one part of the question, yes, because Clarion B centers had to have DSA previously, and I can't see why the requirement wouldn't be to have CTS. But it's obvious that it won't make it in time for the beginning of next year. So what kind of schedule have you in mind for this? When would the first seals come out?
Okay, then I do get, I get your question now. Basically, all the certification that is, and the reviews that are being done at this moment are being done for the new seal. People have already received it, but we have still been calling it either the WDS seal or the DSA seal. But once the Core Trust seal is officially launched, which, like I said, will hopefully be this week, all these seals will be transferred into the Core Trust seal. So if you do start a self-assessment now and you get a review, even if it is before the 1st of January, you will automatically get the Core Trust seal. Does that answer?
So if I understand correctly, we should already start working on these new requirements. Yeah, actually, we started already, but
the requirements itself have not changed. I mean, these requirements have been published since the beginning of this year, and they are the requirements that will be used by the Core Trust seal. Basically, the only thing that will change is the name. So the process, the review, and everything that comes with it will not change, but the name will change. So if there are, I think, about 5 repositories now that we've already given the new seal in since this year, and like I said, they will automatically be transferred to the Core Trust seal. So if you get a certification, if it's DSA or if it's WDS, it will be valid under the Core Trust seal. Like I said, the only thing that will change is the logo.
Okay, so thank you. I think this answers my question. So we will get to work immediately, and I will also pass this information on to the Clarion community.
Yeah,
that they will know. They will then decide how to go on with this.
Yeah, perfect. That will be great. I'm also in contact with, I think, Kevin for Clarion D centers in Germany that need this seal as well. So, yeah, please, if you could get it out to the community, that would be great.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Heiko, there's another question in the chat box from He Wang, which I'm probably not pronouncing correctly, so I'm so sorry about that.
Yes, I just tried to answer it, but sorry, I made a typo. But I answered it in the chat as well. You ask about how to prove you have enough evidence if the evidence is in the intranet. Well, according to the lines of the general guidance lines, we should say make sure that you can make this information, this evidence available to the reviewer in one way or another. Either you give the reviewer limited access, for example, or you in one way or another extract it from the internet and send it to the reviewer. Doesn't have to be that extended, I think, but anyway, the reviewer should, or the 2 reviewers now then should have access to it in one way or another.
Yes, and in later applications, some of this information will need to be made public, even if it is on intranet, through, as you said, Heiko, through summaries and stuff like that.
Yeah. Couldn't you print out the intranet and send it to the reviewer as an appendix to the questionnaire?
Yeah, that could be possible, and that could also mean that the first time you get the certification, it will be accepted as evidence. But as time goes by and you renew your seal, we will be expecting that this information becomes more public. It has to do with the transparency of the data repositories being transparent to their community and to their users and to their depositors to make sure that they are trustworthy, sort of thing. So the more you show to the outside world, the more trustworthy and the more they can control what you're saying in your assessments. So openness is key here.
Yes.
Any more questions? I think not, by the sound of it. Heiko, may I take this opportunity then to thank you very much for your presentation. We had a lot of questions, so also the participants, thank you very much for your input. It's much appreciated. I've been taking notes during the meeting, so I will make sure that all appropriate input will be processed into the document again. And hopefully we will be able to publish it quite soon. I'm aiming for the fourth quarter of this year, and it will be available on the new CoreTrust Seal website that I've mentioned before. If there are any questions or remarks after this meeting or this webinar, please don't hesitate to contact us. All information and input is more than welcome. And I will also be sending you an evaluation form, which I would really appreciate if you could fill to give us some more information. And I will also share the slides that we have been presenting today. So if there are really no questions anymore, no, thank you so much and have a nice day. Bye-bye.